In the heart of old Monterey, California, on Houston Street, you will find a large white two-story Mexican adobe bearing the legend Robert Louis Stevenson House, where, each hour through the day, you can take the tour and be told the timeless love story of Louis and Fanny. You will learn how the young Scotch author, a tall, thin, and gaunt-looking fellow, had hurried to Monterey from his home in Edinburgh in August 1879, having been summoned by the one he loved because she was desperately ill and needed him. The listeners to this oft-told tale gaze at a huge mahogany dining room table, wondering about the proud diners who once sat round such an elegant board. They hear about Jules Simonneau, who fed the penniless Louis in his cafe nearby. They learn about Treasure Island and the famous poem that goes, "Home is a sailor, home from the sea, and the hunter home from the hill." Robert Louis Stevenson was born in 1850 in Edinburgh, Scotland, the guide begins. His father and grandfather were engineers and built lighthouses round the British Isles. Louis should have been an engineer, but his health was too fragile for engineering. So he studied law instead of lighthouses and was admitted to the bar in Scotland. But Louis didn't want to be a lawyer either. No, the guide explains, he wanted to be a slinger of ink. How does his slinging of ink have anything to do with Monterey, the guide questions. The love story begins in 1876 in the small French village of Grez outside Paris. Fanny is there with her two children, Lloyd and Belle. She is studying painting with the artist Millet, being partially estranged from her husband, Sam Osborne of Oakland, California. Louis and his cousin are also part of the same art colony scene. They concoct a meeting with a dark-skinned American lady and her attractive daughter, Belle. Whatever brought them together, Louis fell in love, which later he put into verse. On the stream, deep, swift, and clear, the lilies floated. Fish through the shadows ran. There, thou and I read kindness in our ears and closed the match. Louis and Fanny are blind at first to the complications of their match, which they now carry on in London and Paris. Matters are not helped when Louis develops symptoms of tuberculosis that will be his burden for the next 10 years. The affair seems doomed when Fanny decides to return to California. But before parting, Fanny and Louis decide if one should really need the other, of course they shall get in touch. Sure enough, in August 1879, Fanny cables Louis from California, saying she is desperately ill. Without further delay, Louis decides to leave Scotland for New York City, where he boards an immigrant train for a 10-day journey across the continent to Oakland, California. The wrong way to travel, says the guide. And then he boards the ferry across the bay to San Francisco. His journey ends in Monterey, where he finds Fanny living alone with her children. She has rented a wing of Senora Bonifacio's adobe, with a large parlor adjoining a fragrant garden full of flowers. Louis, of course, would not become a boarder in this household. Monterey was different to anything he could have imagined. The town I was there, he said, was a place of 2 or 3 streets, economically paved with sea sand. He found a room for about $7 a week, but his purse was nearly empty. Also, surprisingly enough, now that Fanny had seen him in the flesh, the likely prospect of marriage and divorce seemed improbable. The young Scotsman decides to go camping as a practical solution to his scanty resources, and give him time to think things out. The train journey plus Fanny's indecisiveness had left him physically and mentally exhausted. He hires a horse and makes his way into the nearby foothills, a veritable wilderness, even today, and a place as remote as a man can go to within a day's ride and get away from it all. What happens next is part of the legend of Robert Louis Stevenson's visit to Monterey. After a few days camping, he falls ill. 2 nights I lay under a tree in a sort of stupor, he tells us, doing nothing but fetch water for myself and horse, light a fire and make coffee, and at night awake, hearing the goat bells ringing and tree frogs singing, whence each noise was enough to make me mad. In all likelihood he would have died if 2 little girls had not found his horse and told their father, who is a goat herder and frontiersman type, who takes Louis back to his goat ranch and looks after him. But Louis is convinced his last moments on earth have come, and decides to compose his epitaph. He roughs out the first draft of a verse that people will repeat for many years to come, and one destined to be carved on his tombstone in Samoa. This be the verse you grave for me. Here he lies where he longs to be. Home is the sailor, home from the sea, and the hunter home from the hill. But Louis recovers and is able to ride back into town. Probably it was the goat's milk that made him better, the guide quips. Fanny decides to go back to Oakland to have it out with Sam about a divorce. Clearly, both their minds are made up. In Monterey, Louis has made friends with a pleasant and kindly Frenchman named Jules Simoneau, who owned a cafe and bar. Jules is the one who finds Louis a place to board. Through help from the regulars in the cafe, Louis lands a part-time job writing for Monterey's weekly newspaper. He signed his articles with a flourish, the Monterey Barbarian. Louis's stay at the old French hotel was spent mostly in bed, reading and writing. The worst is my health, he would write sometimes later, but I don't know. I managed to write a good deal down in Monterey when I was pretty sick most of the time. Before Fanny left Monterey to return to Oakland, his habit was to join the family at their pleasant adobe in the afternoon. Fanny's sister Nellie recalls a fond memory of those dolce far niente days at Monterey. To this house he came often of an afternoon to read results of his morning's work. While we sat in a circle listening in appreciative silence, he nervously paced the room, reading aloud in his full, sonorous voice. Fanny did not return to Monterey, and Louis decides to move to San Francisco. Sam Osborne finally agrees to divorce proceedings, and in 1880, Fanny and Louis were married. That summer they returned to Scotland, where Louis's parents welcomed them with open arms. In the next 14 years, he would produce over 200 works, including 26 novels. Robert Louis Stevenson will finally succumb to a cerebral hemorrhage in Samoa at the age of 44. Here the guide concludes his story. Of course, we Montereyans lay claim to Treasure Island, he majestically explains as he finishes his presentation. Louis admitted as much when he said that he used the California coastline as a setting for his famous book, which he dedicated to his 13-year-old stepson, Sam Lloyd Osborne, an American gentleman. The crouching, hardy live oaks flourish singly or in thickets, the kind of wood for murderers to crawl among, he wrote in his essay about the old Pacific capital. In the Stevenson house, you will find the original illustration by Walter Tittle, showing John Silver, agile as a monkey, even without leg or crutch, was on top of him next moment and had twice buried his knife up to the hilt in that defenseless body. Why do we have a Stevenson house? Asked the guide, before taking his listeners through the old adobe. This you will find out for yourself by visiting the State Historical Monument operated by the California Department of Parks and Recreation, where each hour through the day you can take the tour and be treated to the timeless story of the love affair between Louis and Fanny, Monterey, 1879.